But in terms of the pacing itself, you're not going to see a 70.3. You're not going to go out and suddenly do a lot of punchy riding and like really accelerate, decelerate. You should kind of keep that same even keel.
That Triathlon Show 131. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode we discuss pacing on the bike with Ryan Cooper, founder of Best Bike Split, chief scientist at Training Peaks, and a world-leading expert on the physics of cycling and how it translates into practical pacing advice. Many of you are probably already familiar with Best Bike Split, and if you're not, we'll talk a bit more about how you can use this software in the interview. I really like it myself. I think it's incredible. And you can sign up for a free account, which already gives you many great functionalities to really help you bike better, pace better, and ultimately run better off the bike as well. If there is a bit of a background noise now in the intro and the outro of the episode, not during the interview, that's because I'm again recording while traveling. I'm now sitting at an airport cafe, heading back to Finland for a week for my sister's graduation from high school, which is a big thing in the Scandinavian countries at least. So congratulations to her, and I look forward to seeing her and my family again. But let's not waste any more time on chit-chat. Let's thank our sponsors. This episode is sponsored by Precision Hydration, and as a regular listener, you already know that Precision Hydration helps you optimize your hydration in training and in racing for you individually, because everybody's sweat sodium content is individual. It's not a one-size-fits-all. And you can take their free online sweat test on precisionhydration.com. It's just a short, simple quiz to find out how you should fuel. One thing that I received quite some questions about recently is how do you rehydrate after exercise? You may know that when you exercise you can only absorb around about 1 liter per hour of fluid, but your sweat rate can be significantly higher than that, so you will have a net loss of fluid in your body. And long story short about rehydrating, you'll want to drink 1.5 times the amount of fluid that you lost net, because you will lose some of that rehydration fluid through additional sweat and urine losses. And to reduce these losses, you'll want to take in plenty of sodium with that. So as an example, even if I fuel a workout with the pH 1000 electrolyte drink, the 1000 means that it's just a certain strength of milligrams per liter of fluid. But I'll rehydrate with a stronger, more concentrated pH 1500, 500 to 1000 milliliters of that, and then the rest of my rehydration fluid will be just plain water. And this is especially important when I want to recover quickly, that I'm really particular about rehydrating enough and taking in that sodium. All That Triathlon Show listeners can get their first box of Precision Hydration product for free by going to precisionhydration.com and using the discount code ThatTriathlonShow, all one word, all caps. Now let's move on to the interview with Ryan Cooper. Today's guest on That Triathlon Show is Ryan Cooper of Best Bike Split. Ryan, how are you today?
I'm doing great.
Brilliant. Yeah, I've been looking forward to this for quite some time, since I heard you actually first on the Trainer Road podcast, I think, and I've been using Best Bike Split on and off myself and really like it, but I'm not like a super big user of it yet, so it will be interesting to hear more about that and about pacing in general, whether you use Best Bike Split or not. But first, tell us a little bit about Best Bike Split and how it works.
Sure. So Best Bike Split, kind of originally, as we conceived it, was an app to help mainly triathletes and time trialists plan and execute race strategy. So the idea was, if we looked at a course, we looked at the significant elevation changes or gradient changes and looked at the significant direction changes, could we take that information about the athlete, their bike, kind of their aerodynamic profile, and then pull in information about the wind and road conditions and plan out a strategy for an athlete to basically get the biggest benefit for their power output. So the idea was if you had a goal power or a goal time, we could kind of show you how best to utilize your effort across the course.
So can you give some very simple but specific examples? So if it's not clear yet for somebody, how would a person actually go about using it? If they just sign up and they have a race, how would they benefit from Best Bike Split?
Sure. So if you sign up and you have a race, first we kind of walk you through setting up a profile. So we ask for some basic information: your height, your weight, your FTP, your training altitude, just to kind of get some information about you. Then we drill into what kind of bike you have, the type of wheels you'll be racing with, the tires, and that gives us some information, some basic information about your drag, at least from a high level, super high level perspective. And then you can search for your course. So we try and crowdsource all the courses on the system in terms of your specific race course. So you can search for that. And then if it doesn't exist, you can use a program like Ride with GPS or Strava to draw the course and then upload it to us. And then once you have that kind of information, and then you can go and create what we call a race plan, select your bike, select either a power target, normalized power target, or a goal time, or if you kind of use advanced metrics, you could target a specific training stress score, TSS. And from that, we take in weather data, the course that you've input, and then information about you to plan out your strategy. From there, you can either download that onto a head unit to actually race with it, or you can pre-train on Zwift or train a road using those kind of power targets beforehand. So you kind of have some different options for what you can do after the fact.
Yeah, that gives a lot of flexibility, which is great, I think, because some athletes may know from previous races they can hold this specific normalized power or a specific distance, and then they can just set that and assess what time they can hope to achieve on a different race course. Whereas for others, they might be looking to beat, let's say, 5 hours for a 70.3 and want to get a certain time on the bike to achieve that. And then they'll just have to find out what the power they need to push at different segments of the bike course is. And even for some, like especially with Ironman athletes, when I coach, when we make a race plan, I tend to give them an upper level of the TSS that they cannot cross, because then it will negatively impact their bike. So that third option is also, although I would guess that it's less used than the other two, but I think it has a lot of merit to it to use TSS as well to at least validate the race plan that you create.
Yeah, we definitely we added TSS fairly early on, and for that very reason. For every Ironman course or every 70.3 course is different. So if you look at, say, an Ironman Florida, where you have nice and flat, you may be able to break 5 hours on the bike at Florida. But then if you look at a Ironman France or Wisconsin or something that has quite a bit of hills in it, then that trying to break 5 hours there is probably not wise. And so you kind of normalize the difficulty of the courses by using TSS as a target. And then it kind of gets, to that athlete, then you can kind of explain to them that, yeah, you may be able to do a 5 hour here, but it may be better to do a 5:20 or a 5:30 at a different race course for that same physiological impact.
Yeah, that's a very good explanation of it. So just to make sure that everybody's on board, you would get the race plan broken down into a lot of different segments. Like on this hill, you are supposed to hold this power, and on this flat, you can hold this power. And it also incorporates weather and wind data or predictions, I guess. So it's very, very detailed and specific in that sense. But if we talk about bike pacing in general, like this is what you would get from a best bike split plan. But how should athletes approach pacing their bike legs of triathlons?
Sure. So, I mean, for the majority of people, so there are some exceptions to the rule, obviously, but for the majority of people, um, what we call VI is variability index. It's the difference between a normalized power and an average power. So, for the vast majority of athletes, in the vast majority of courses, you're going to want to kind of shrink that gap between those two numbers, which means a kind of more steady state pace. That being said, within that margin, there's kind of a general rule of thumb of a VI of 1.05, so or less. So when you think about that, it's your normalized power is 5% higher than your average power. So within that 5%, there's still quite a bit of flexibility. Some courses, obviously, you may go higher if there's a lot of climbing. If your gearing is not correctly kind of thought through, then you may have to go higher in that as well. But for the most part, your pacing is going to kind of fluctuate in that range. And so what Best Bike Split does is we don't actually give it any hard constraints or hard boundaries on that. And we just let the math kind of work itself out. And it turns out that the math works itself out to where, for the most part, depending on the weather and the hill conditions, you're going to still be in that same kind of VI range. And so it just turned out that's how the math kind of plays itself out. That is the optimal place to kind of keep your pacing. That's not to say that you should ride the flats and the hills at the exact same power. You're still going to want to vary that and maybe push a little bit harder up the hills, and then a little bit harder into the headwind, because that little extra effort there is actually giving you more time benefit than a completely steady state, hold 200 watts on the uphill, hold 200 watts on the downhill. If you did 210 on the uphill and 190 or 180 or whatever on the downhill, there's going to be a benefit to that for the same power.
But it's in that range. So if you have your average power, or your normalist power might be 200, then maybe what you would aim to hold on the punchy hills, etc., would be 210 and into headwinds, but not much more than that. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the gradient, of course. So, on a minor hill, we kind of break it down. We have what we call a cheat sheet. So, we break it down by segment. But if you wanted something more generalized, then we kind of say, okay, for this athlete on a 1 to 2 grade hill, this is the kind of power. On a 2 to 4, on a 4 to 6, or a 6+. And part of that's just because the steeper the hill, the more power you're going to have to output just to stay upright on the bike. So at some point, you kind of just have to put out what you have to put out. What we do find, and what we see in data files, and in regardless of it's an amateur or even professional side, that athletes tend to push too hard on most hills. So you look at somebody and they're going along at 20, 22 miles per hour, 36 kilometers an hour, and they hit this hill and they start to slow, then they feel this like need to keep that speed going. So they keep pushing a little bit harder, and then eventually they slow down. But what you find is that the power that they're outputting trying to keep that speed up is way over what they a good steady state power level. So even if they should go 30 or 40 watts higher, let's say on a 6% grade, and they're looking at 200 watts, if they should be at 240, a lot of times you'll see that they're maybe at 260, 280, and then they feel that later on in the ride.
Yeah, no, that's really good advice, and good to hear. Like, because it's always useful for athletes to hear what the general tendency of other athletes is, because then that makes you more aware of where you might be making those mistakes yourself. And I can definitely recognize myself that I would fall in that category of probably pushing hills a bit too hard. Although I focus mostly on draft legal racing, which is a bit different, but still.
That's quite a bit different. Which, but we can talk about that a little bit as well.
Yeah, we can, but let's start a bit with, are there any specific differences between 70.3 and Ironman pacing, like, and anything that you've noticed throughout watching and analyzing data with Best Bike Split?
I mean, I think it comes down to, for that, I really do kind of fall back to TSS a lot. The pacing strategy is not going to change too much. However, Your nutrition strategy is going to change a little bit more on Ironman. Your percentage of FTP, for instance, will change quite a bit. You'll see a lot of amateurs that there's not that much difference. They may do 75% of FTP for a 70.3 and 70% for an Ironman, whereas a professional may do close to 90% for a 70.3 and 85 to 80 or even 76% on an Ironman. And it really just it's race dependent, condition dependent, but in terms of the pacing itself, you're not going to see a 70.3. You're not going to go out and suddenly do a lot of punchy riding and like really accelerate, decelerate. You should kind of keep that same even keel. But since you're out there for 2 to 3 hours less, probably 3 hours less, on a 70.3, then your percentage of FTP can jump up a little bit. Your nutrition may be a little bit different than it would be on an Ironman. But your pacing will probably be pretty consistent, in that same VI range.
Yeah. So can you repeat those numbers again for the intensity factor or percentage of FTP?
Oh, sure. So, I think for an amateur, anything you're going to be below 80% of FTP. So for a 70.3, somewhere between 75 and 80, whereas for a full Ironman, you're looking at 65 to 75. Now that can change, obviously, depending on, the course and how fit you are and, kind of your lead up to the race. For a professional, you're looking at a 70.3 is going to be 85 to 90. Lionel Sanders will hold, 90% of his FTP for 70.3, no problem. But they're only out there for 2 hours versus 2.5 to 4 into 3 hours. So for an Ironman distance, if you look at some of the best pros, Jan Frodeno, when he won a couple years ago in Kona, he held 76%. It was the pretty textbook Ironman pacing, right at 76%, VI of like 1.02. So, even at a hilly, hard course, he kind of just went right by the numbers and it played out very well for him. So you kind of see different athletes that have different strengths. If your strength is the bike and you can bike and run okay off of it, then you can push that percentage up a little bit, maybe 2 to 3%. Whereas, if you're going to be struggling on the run, you want that TSS a little bit lower, so that percentage may come down a little bit.
And do you know off the top of your head what kind of TSS an amateur athlete would want to cap their 7.3 and Ironman bike legs at?
So I always go back to the old Joe Friel blog post from I don't know. He's kind of done the how to cheat by using a power meter blog post from many years ago, 2012 or 11 maybe. And it kind of has the Ironman times and TSS broken down into strong runners based on time. And so I kind of use that as the baseline. And I think it's different for males versus females as well, just because you may spend a little bit more time out on the course. So for males, I kind of go with the 280 is kind of the cap on an Ironman for TSS. You can go higher than that. And I've seen a lot of female racers go up to 300 and do really, really well. But I kind of go with that 280. For the 70.3, 165 to 170. And you see amateurs and pros performing pretty well off of those kind of numbers.
Yeah. I think Jim Vance's book, Triathlon 2.0, also has these kinds of numbers. I seem to remember that for a full Ironman, that it's in the 300 to 310 range for more advanced age groupers, at least, because that's the most recent one that I looked up when I was making a race plan for an athlete. But so it's a bit higher than the ones you cite, which actually in that same book, I also think that the intensity factors for 70.3 and Ironman pacing were a bit higher. But there is variability, and that's where you need to, I guess, practice see in training how it feels. Is this something that could be sustainable for you as an individual athlete?
For sure. And I actually have Jim's book right there. I'm looking at it. But yeah, it's we do see the spectrum from 275 to 310 kind of being that range. I tend to go on the lower end just because I think a lot of people they'll overestimate how well they think they can run off the bike. And so a lot of times you'll see, if they're shooting for that high number at the high elite amateur level, pro level, they know their bodies pretty well. As you get down to the more general athletes, once they get out there, there's the thing that you have in your head, and then there's reality that comes and hits you, and you're like, I almost rather you have a smile on your face and like be running really well and leave that extra 2 or 3 minutes on the bike. You lose that 3 minutes, but you gain maybe 30 by not having to walk aid stations and those kind of things. So it's definitely a individual range. But yeah, I think, as you get more elite, you get more in tune with your numbers, then you can start pushing those intensity factors and those TSS numbers up.
Yeah, and what you say there about keeping to the lower end of that range, that makes sense from the perspective also that if you can give a power range of, let's say, 200 to 210 watts for an athlete, then they can easily end up doing 250 to 220 watts in reality. Whereas if you have a race plan that says 190 to 200 and they end up doing 205, the damage isn't quite that big. So you have that margin of error built in already. So it makes sense from that perspective as well. So what about, you mentioned there, draft legal racing. Can we use Best Bike Split for that? Or do you have any guidance on pacing in general in draft legal racing?
So I think in draft legal racing, much like, pure road racing and crit racing and those kind of things, it's quite a bit different beast. What we use Best Bike Split for there, and we've done work with the U.S. Olympic team and the draft legal triathlon team, as well as quite a few of the teams at the tour on the road side, is we look for places where it makes the most sense to sit in. So you look for kind of the places on the course that strategically you would want to not be taking a pull because you want to save your energy, or where you may see somebody trying to make a break. So for instance, there could be a place where you have a crosswind to a tailwind. And so if you have a crosswind to a tailwind, if you're looking for somebody to make a break, they kind of have the advantage of, there's less advantage on the draft on the cross. When they make the turn to the tail, the chase pack has to work much harder to close that gap. Whereas if they turn into a headwind, then the chase pack can rotate at the front and drill and pull you back in pretty quickly. So we have some tools that we've worked on and we have up on the site that allow you to do that. It's a very manual process. You still have to go in and analyze it yourself. But basically it kind of gives you a strategic idea of what the course looks like. And what we call our time analysis, the tool allows you to do things like adjust your drag. So if you adjust drag, say, kind of 40 to 50% lower, then you can kind of see the equivalent power that would be required sitting in the group on different sections. Obviously on the hills, then it's kind of just, if somebody goes, you either have to, you make a choice to have to go or you let them go. So there is the strategy out on the race day, but having a little bit better understanding of where the wind is when you make different turns, where you can sit in the pack and save energy, gives you, a little bit of advantage potentially going into those kind of races.
Yeah. Okay. So for people that just want the general pacing advice, you would want to be sitting in when there's a headwind and potentially even on a downhill, whatever the wind is, and then the place to make a break is when you have a tailwind or maybe crosswind to tailwind, and when you're going uphill. Was that right?
Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, in a tailwind, it's tricky to make a break in a tail just because, everybody's going so fast. So the power required to overcome, even with the tailwind, the power to overcome at high speeds, say, you're going 30 miles an hour with a tailwind, or, 50 kilometers an hour with a tailwind, the extra power it takes to overcome that is very difficult. So if you already have a gap into the tailwind, it's nice because the chase pack has to work that much harder to try and drag in the people out front. So I would suggest, yeah, if you are going to make a break, then try and do it before, try and get that gap before you hit the big tailwind. And, even if it's a nice tailwind into a climb, then that's kind of nice as well. So, but yeah, so that's kind of how we use best bike split. It's not so much for the pacing; it's more for the, trying to determine what you think the physiological load is going to be of the people you're racing against.
Yeah, and the tool within Best Bike Split for those. And by the way, Best Bike Split has a free accounts for people that want to check it out. So that's a really good place to start. And it's the time analysis tool there that you play around with the different parameters, and that's how you use it for things like draft legal racing and road racing.
Right. So that's probably the primary way you would use it for road racing. We didn't really envision that when we first built the tool. Originally, it was mostly around what if scenarios and goal setting. So just to kind of give a high level overview of what the time analysis tool is, it's basically has your race plan, and then you can vary your drag, your CD, your aerodynamic drag, your power, and your weight, and then see the impact of those changes, not just at the high level, but on an individual section level. So, for instance, if you said, okay, let me look at this race. Well, for this particular course, I've got this 2 kilos to lose. If I lose those 2 kilos, what's the impact of that versus, well, I know I can increase my power by 3% before a race. What's the impact of that? And you can do, any combination of those changes to see how that would impact your race, and then where specifically on course it has the biggest impact. So, we kind of originally developed it as that kind of thing to give the user or a coach ultimate control of like what factors are influencing this race the most. The outcome was at the Tour de France 2 years ago. Several teams reached out to us, and they were using it specifically for different stages to say, hey, on this kind of climb, what kind of power, let's up the power for this specific climb, and then see what the, power to weight impact is for, a Dumoulin versus, a different type of rider. Not that specific one, but, if a bigger power rider versus a very small climber, what kind of power differences do they need to have to kind of limit losses and those kind of things?
Yeah, so I think it's a brilliant tool. As you say, you can do what if scenarios and prioritize your next steps. Is it to try to lose some weight, or try to gain power, try to improve aerodynamics? And that's a great segue into actually discussing for triathlon and I guess mostly for non-draft racing and 7.3s and Ironmans in particular. What have you seen to be the relative importance of these three: aerodynamics, power, and weight?
Yeah, so I think for 95% of triathlon courses, at least in the United States, we try not to. Every triathlon course in the U.S. seems to be pretty vanilla compared to pretty not a lot of climbing, pretty straightforward. There's a few different, there's a few that have it, but so for 95% of those courses, aerodynamic drag is kind of the biggest factor that we see. So, in power, of course. So, you trade off those two. Weight, because there's not a lot of climbing in the courses that we have here, tends to be one of those things where people pay attention to it a lot, and they're always trying to lose weight off their bike or off these other things. But really, the time is probably better spent focusing on, improving your drag numbers, meaning getting in a more aerodynamic position, getting a good bike fit, making sure that your clothing, we find that clothing is a big impact on drag. So making sure that, you see a lot of people using the longer sleeve tri-suits now, and that does make a pretty big difference in terms of your drag. So you can kind of think of it this way: for physics wise, the faster you go, the more impact drag has. So one is exponential with speed, whereas the other one is linear with speed. So weight's linear with speed. In terms of rolling resistance, as you start to go uphill, there's a crossover. So once you hit a little bit below maybe 20 kilometers an hour, then the weight part starts to take kind of a bigger priority on uphill sections. So there's a speed and gradient where the gravity, is kind of starting to play a much bigger role. And so that's around 20 kilometers an hour. Before that, or higher than that, you want to make sure that your aerodynamic drag is kind of the forefront of thinking.
Do you happen to have some numbers, some example in front of you, or do you have best bike split open so that we can kind of play around with what improving aerodynamics, improving power, and improving weight can do, just to illustrate it?
Sure. I do happen to have it open. So for instance, if I just look at Kona, because that's a good course that has, significant amount of climbing and some, big weather and other things like that. If you're looking at somebody that's got a normalized power of 195, somewhere around that area, so they're doing 190 average power across the course. You can look at an average position triathlete would finish in over 5 hours, so 5:15, 5:20, somewhere in that range, and that's around a 72 kilo, 73 kilo kind of rider. So if you drop, let's say 3%, so let's 2 kilos, let's say you drop that off, you're only looking at a benefit on that course of about 1:30. So, I mean, a lot of athletes, I don't know that they could even drop 2 kilos and still be in a healthy range, especially if you see the people at Kona. Yeah, there's not a lot of weight to drop. But conversely, if you kind of optimize your aerodynamics and just to throw out some numbers and try not to get too technical, CDA is coefficient of drag multiplied by your frontal area. So what the wind sees, basically. The CD is the shape part of your body, where the A is the area. So the kind of just what the wind sees versus the shape and how the wind reacts to that body. And so the numbers, the kind of range of numbers that you see in triathlon are somewhere between 0.23 and 0.3. So 0.3 is kind of a high position, mid-pack age grouper, kind of a comfortable position, if you will. Whereas a 0.23 would be more of the professionals. You see so you see a Jan Frodeno, or you see a Josh Amberger or somebody like that. Like they're very low, very tight, very aerodynamic position. So if I go kind of from that spectrum and I say right in the middle, a 0.26, most athletes can get down to a 0.24, 0.245 pretty easily. And so if you're looking at a 0.26 to a 0.245 on that same Kona course at the same power, you're looking at a 6:40 to 7 minute.
So more than 5 minutes more to gain compared to losing 2 kilos.
Right. And it's really not that hard to get into those positions. So, it takes some work. You have to get used to riding in that position. And what I like to tell athletes is you could have the most perfect aerodynamic position in the wind tunnel and it looks amazing and you're a 0.2 or whatever else. But then if you're only in it for 25% of the time on course, then it's not doing you any good. Right. So there is that comfort versus aerodynamic trade-off that you have to get to. And so it just takes time to work on that position over time. And so that kind of gets you into that, once you work on it over time and you get what I like to call, do you look more like a bullet or do you look more like a barn door? And the more you look like a bullet, the faster you're going to go. And so you start to get yourself into that more compact position. You get used to riding 95% of the time in aero. And then you could use a tool like Best Bike Split to say, hey, if I'm going to get out of aero to stretch or do whatever, where's the best place on course to do that. So you can adjust your drag and say, if my drag is super high, where am I losing the least amount of time for that sitting up and stretching and those kind of things.
Yeah. And what about if we manipulate power from the 195 normalized? How much power do we need to improve the normalized to gain the same amount of time as we did by dropping CDA from 0.26 to 0.245?
So you would need about 5% more. So is what it's looking at.
And that would be like 10 watts or something?
That is, let's see. Yeah, almost. Yeah, right at 10 watts.
Okay.
So you're looking at, and that's 10 watts over 5 hours, right? So it's a lot of kilojoules, put it that way.
Yeah. So speaking of CDA and aerodynamics, that's also a feature that you have in Best Bike Split, the Aero Analyzer. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So this is a beta feature that we rolled out, I guess, almost over a year ago now, last April. And what we found is the hardest thing for everybody kind of knows their FTP. Everybody's got a power meter, so they've got good, idea of what their power is. You get on the scale, you know what your weight is. CDA is one of those things that it's so difficult to measure outside of a wind tunnel that we wanted to give athletes and coaches a way to estimate their CDA a little bit better than what we had in the past. So we started off with kind of these drop downs. Where do you fit? Are you an elite time trialist? Are you a mid packer? And that kind of gives you a baseline. And then we'd adjust it by the type of wheels and things that you had. From there, we went to a fit based calculation where you use numbers from your bike fit. And that kind of gave you a little bit better estimate of where your drag was. But we wanted to get more refined because it does impact your plan and your estimated time so much. We wanted to make sure that the estimate that we gave was as close as we could get without coming out and getting you in the wind tunnel or measuring you outside or something like that. So we came up with what we call the Aero Analyzer, and what it does is you upload a race file, and I suggest a race. If you go do a test run outside, then make sure you have your full race gear and try and do at least a 15 to 20 kilometer ride where you vary speed a little bit, power and speed every couple minutes. And what it does is it breaks down your ride file and attempts to pick out what your race aerodynamic number would be, and then what we call a relaxed aerodynamic number, which would be more of a climbing position or something when you're out of your aero position. What do you look like? And so we rolled that out, and in conjunction with some wind tunnel study we did with United Healthcare cycling team. And so what we did is we go to the wind tunnel, go outside and actually do the rides and then compare those numbers. And what we found is that in general, we could get within 1% to 2%, given good data from the riders. And then when we were off by fairly large, significant amount of percentage, so 9%, what we found is that what they look like in the tunnel and what they look like out on the road was completely different. So they were holding one position in the wind tunnel when they head down, completely tucked. Then when they got on the road, their heads up because they want to see where they're going. And so if you looked at images or videos, they were completely different outside than they were in the tunnel. Similarly, a couple of riders they wore a speed suit in the tunnel, and then outside, one wore kind of a more thermal. It was a little chilly, so he wore a thermal suit that was flapping. And you could tell a significant difference between the speed suit in the tunnel and the kind of flapping in the breeze suit outside. So
yeah, well, that's brilliant, and that gives athletes a way to get a handle of their aerodynamics and start getting the more accurate race plans by knowing a little bit about how aerodynamic you are. Any final advice on anything that we discussed today, like pacing or aerodynamics, or anything really based on what you've learned over the years with Best Bike Split?
Yeah, I mean, I think Beginners, especially, what we see is, and it's kind of interesting, the more advanced you are and the more you've raced, you kind of naturally find this rhythm. And if we compare a plan to an athlete that's been racing for a long time, if we look at a pro time trialist or something like that, what we see is that they naturally already do this, this plan. So you look at, somebody that's been racing for 20 years, and you go and you say, you overlay their actuals to the plan, and you say, wow, they follow it almost perfectly without ever having looked at it. It's once you start to look at athletes that are, newer to the sport, or they've been doing the sport for a while, but they're not at that elite level, that you really start to see, like, that's where the huge benefit is for it in terms of pacing strategy. It's great for anybody that wants to look at times and wants to kind of come up with a general race plan, and kind of get an idea of what happens from one course to the other. But the actual raw pacing, teaching somebody to pace early on, then that's something that they start to learn, and it becomes ingrained in their kind of normal race day preparation. So I think that's originally who we really built it for, and it's just nice to see when people actually execute it, and then they come back and say, "Oh man, that was perfect," and I had a great race. Not only did I have a great bike, but I had a great run after the bike, and that's what we really like to hear, is that it's not just about the bike for triathlon, it's about the whole race. And so if you plan the bike correctly, then at the end of the race, you can have a really, you're having your best race and best run off the bike, is kind of the thing that we get the most excited about.
Yeah, and pacing is such a critical part of endurance sports. So you have a lot of guys that are not necessarily the most talented athletes, but they're really good at pacing and racing, and that's what makes them world class. And even if it's making them top at the age group level compared to other potentially more talented quote unquote athletes than themselves, if you can pace well, then you have a big upper hand against the rest of your competition. So, and Best Bike Split definitely helps athletes do that. So, any final words on Best Bike Split in particular, and why and who should give it a try?
Well, we want everybody to give it a try, but just some heads up on some things that we're working on now. One of the things that we've found out as we've been doing this is that you look at how bike manufacturers kind of make their equipment, and they have a range of people that they're basically targeting. And what we find is that the lower power athletes, a lot of times they can't follow a plan that has a low VI, just because their gearing ratio just doesn't exist. They either need to be on compact rings and they're not, or they need to have, a much bigger cassette in the back. So one of the things we're starting to look at is, how do we incorporate gear ratios into planning, and can we suggest, maybe equipment changes going into a race, and then having some input to put a minimum VI. For instance, if someone is not going to pedal on the downhill and they're going to be coasting a lot, can we build that into the plan and then subsequently show them the impact of that? So, if you get better at descending, here's the kind of time savings you can get on this type of course. And so the final piece of our original puzzle is to then kind of expand upon the post-race analysis. So being able to take your race files and then have that enhance your individual model, so that the next time you run a course, it knows things about how well do you take turns, how good of a descender are you, more information about your aerodynamic drag when you tend to sit up versus kind of when you're holding in, and start to point out areas that you may want to work on. So that's kind of the next phase of our big puzzle, and so we're shooting for Q3 release of that before Kona. So that's something hopefully for people to look forward to and enjoy.
Very cool. Yeah, and I have to plug your Kona predictions that you have been doing every year for quite a few years now, and those are always really fun to follow. And you predict what some of the pro athletes are going to do, and then we can watch and see what they actually end up doing. And it's
Yeah.
really good with the predictions that you do. So
So yeah, some of it, it's so interesting. Kona is by far, we use that as our baseline test course for pretty much most things because it is so difficult for in terms of weather forecasting and things like that. It's very if for people that aren't familiar with the island, it's got these microclimates. So uh, several times in the past few years, what you'll see is that you'll have this mild kind of headwind on the way out. And that's why it looks like a bunch of people are kind of lined up in a big line, is because you have this mild kind of headwind going out. And so nobody really wants to put in a hard effort to kind of get away. You make a big turn up Havi, which is the climb to the turnaround, and now you have a different headwind that's blowing much harder. And so now you have this really strong headwind. And as the day kind of goes on, the kind of wind starts to clock around. And so on the way back, the slower you go out, the more headwind you have coming back too. So you kind of go headwind to headwind, and then the wind's clocking around, and you have headwind coming back. And so it's always a very difficult course to kind of model that out. Last year was an aberration, so they never got the headwind coming back, and so you had all the huge crosswind headwinds didn't show up last year, and so you saw the impact on the time. Going from a 4:20, 4:18 kind of time range to a 4:12. So it'll be interesting to see. I don't think we'll see any more records falling there unless the wind can kind of play nice again.
Yeah. Well, who knows? We will just have to wait and see. But let's now wrap this up with some rapid fire questions that I want you to answer in just one sentence or less. And
Okay.
the first one is: what's your favorite book, blog, or resource related to cycling, triathlon, or endurance sports?
So I go old school. I still have it on my desk. It's called Bicycling Science. This is the third edition. It's probably 1999, 1998, but it is everything that you've ever wanted to know in detail about the physics, the physiology. I mean, just kind of it breaks down bicycling into very, the very, very low level in the weeds details.
And what's your favorite piece of gear or equipment?
It's got to be Aero helmet. It just looks so cool. Anytime you see somebody with an Aero helmet, you go, man, like the first time I saw one, I go, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen.
Some would go, that guy looks like a douche.
Yeah, I know. But to see it, but then you look at it and you go, you say that until you put one on, then you go, man, this is cool.
Who's somebody in cycling, triathlon, or endurance sports that you look up to and admire?
So I've got so many, but I'm going to say there's a coach. He's a former pro cyclist, Ben Day. He coaches some triathletes and a bunch of cyclists now. But there was something he said to me last year, and it just kind of it stuck with me, and it's something I hope we can build off of. But he said, as coaches or as high performance people, our lives are spent swimming in numbers. But he goes, but the performance so often is in between the years and how you can react to it. And that it just stuck with me. It's like, yeah, everybody, you get these numbers, you get all this stuff. But if you don't have it, in your head, and you don't have the plan, and you don't know how to react to different things, then there's no way you're going to perform up to your abilities.
That is true. What was the name of the coach?
Ben Day.
Say it again.
UI.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's about wraps it up for this interview. So for listeners that want to check out Best Bike Split, it's on bestbikesplit.com. And do you have any social media accounts that you want to plug here?
Sure. I think Best Bike Split on Twitter is our main kind of outlet for social. We also have a Facebook page. But yeah, so I think on the Twitter is kind of how we get most of the information out.
Okay, thank you so much, Ryan. This has been really, really great talking about pacing, aerodynamics, and best bike split. It was a real pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much.
Hope you enjoyed that interview. My main takeaway here is that really the big mistake that many age group athletes make in their racing, especially long course non-draft, is that they have way too many occasions when their power goes way up, even if it doesn't feel that much because there are short bursts. But this is not the optimal way to pace any race. I've made quite a few race plans in Best Bike Split for myself and also for athletes that I coach, and when you look at it, you'll be surprised to see that usually you have very few occasions when your power goes even just a little bit above threshold. Usually it stays below that and well below that, depending on the distance of your race, of course. So the call to action here is to go and sign up for a free Best Bike Split account, add your profile, your bike and the goal race course, then create a race plan and see what your ideal pacing strategy for that course would be. Also, use the time analysis tool to see what impact changes in your power, your aerodynamics, or your weight might have on that bike split. That will be very insightful. And I had a funny incident here when I did a race plan for an athlete that I coach, Adam, down at a training camp in the Algarve, when we looked at his Ironman 70.3 race plan through Best Bike Split. And we used the time analysis tool to change his weight and or see what would happen if he lost some weight. And we saw that, the change in time was really minimal on the bike, that is. So he funnily said that, for that I'm not even going to bother trying. So that's quite it can be very insightful when you learn to see that in biking and most Ironman courses and 7.3 courses, they are relatively flat. So changes in your power and your aerodynamics definitely trump changes in your weight. As usual, you can find the show notes for this episode on thattriathlonshow.com. Leave any comments or questions there on that show notes page. And one more thing that I want to mention is that if you missed last episode, it was a case study with David Nichols on how to qualify for Kona. And I got a lot of really good feedback, so I'm very thankful for that. And if you want to get on the podcast as a case study, you don't need to be qualified for Kona. You can be a beginner. That's totally fine. We need different sorts of demographics, triathlon demographics. Definitely send me an email at michael@scientifictriathlon.com, and that's Michael with a K. And tell me that you want to get on and tell me a little bit about yourself, and we'll set it up. Finally, please keep spreading the word about the podcast by telling your friends, emailing your triathlon clubs. Do whatever you can to help spread the word. It's really, really important to get the word out there and make more listeners find out about this podcast. And another great way to help with that is to rate and review the podcast on iTunes or on the Apple Podcast app or any podcast app that you use. And you can also go to scientifictriathlon.com/rate if you're not quite sure how to do that. I've written some instructions there on how it all works. So I really, really appreciate it if you take just a minute to leave a review. It would really, really make my day. Finally, thank you to Precision Hydration for sponsoring this episode. You can find them on precisionhydration.com. And they can give you electrolyte products to help you meet your individual sweat sodium content and sodium losses through sweat in your training and races. You can get your first box for free when you use the discount code ThatTriathlonShow, all one word, all caps, at checkout. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.